You are sitting at a table where no one speaks. The man across from you cuts his bread without looking up. You ask a question simple, harmless, and he chews as if you hadn't made a sound. Around you, the candle flickers but gives no heat. You want to scream, not because he's cruel, but because he's unmoved. His silence is not absence. It is a presence louder than words, older than language, older than love. You remember men who tried to explain themselves. Their mouths moved, and their souls bled out in the process. They pleaded for understanding. They exposed their fears like children confessing nightmares, and you hated them for it. Not because they were wrong, but because they gave you nothing to resist. No mystery to kneel before. So you return to the man who says nothing, not because he is kind, not because he is safe, but because his silence feels like God turning away, and you would rather chase that divine coldness than be held by mortal warmth. If this silence already knows, you let it echo. Like the video. Leave your shadow in the comments. Subscribe. And stay near the ache. He who does not explain himself becomes a shrine, because nothing awakens worship like withheld meaning. You step into him the way a child steps into a cathedral, uncertain if she should whisper or pray. His silence is not emptiness. It is architecture. Pillars of unsaid things hold the ceiling of his presence high above your head, and you feel small beneath it, sacred in your confusion. He has never justified a word, never clarified an intention, and so every gesture he makes becomes stained glass, cryptic, glowing, impossible to read from within. He leaves you in the pews with your knees trembling, and you are thankful for the ache. He walks past you like he's carrying an altar inside his ribs. You want to know what burns behind his ribs, a wound, a secret, a hymn. But he gives you nothing, not an explanation, not a confession. And so you fill in the silence with your own offerings. You become the choir. You interpret his shrugs like scripture. When he does not call, you imagine he is grieving. When he disappears, you believe it is because he is too noble, too burdened, too broken. Never because he simply does not want you. You worship not him, but what he refuses to reveal. Other men have spoken too clearly. They offered blueprints of their minds, spreadsheets of their pasts. They told you why they hurt, what they feared, how they loved. And each sentence made them smaller. With every explanation, they became more human, more forgivable, more manageable until you could fit them inside a paragraph and feel no awe. But this man gives you none of that. No logic, no sequence, no backstory. Only a door he never opens, a face he never lifts. And the sacred tremble in your spine comes not from what he gives, but what he withholds. You do not understand him, and so you feel close to God. When he touches you, it feels like ritual, not because it is tender, but because it is wordless. There is no narration, no justification, no promise, just the cold press of skin. Like a sacrament being administered without your consent. You try to ask what it means. He looks at you, then looks away, and you mistake that for transcendence. For what else can you do when the priest never speaks, but the candles still burn? You dream of changing him, but you call it devotion. You listen for crumbs the way he says your name, the silence between his sighs. You trace his absence like a map. You imagine his childhood. You write novels in your head explaining why he never calls you back, and everyone ends in tragedy, so that your longing feels holy. You suffer for him. You fast from dignity. You kneel before his indifference like it's a sermon, and you never stop to ask if this is sacred. Why does it bleed? You confuse silence for depth, detachment for strength, coldness for clarity, but it is not your fault. The altar is empty, and you were raised to believe that what isn't there must be divine. You were taught to fill in the gaps, to love the potential of a man instead of the reality. So when he offers nothing, you offer everything. When he closes the door, you build a stained glass window from the shards. When he does not speak, you translate the silence into poetry. And when it hurts, when you ache so badly you want to scream, you call it intimacy. Because at least you feel something. There is a comfort in mystery. Not because it is kind, but because it gives you something to solve. And in solving it, you forget yourself. You become the girl in the cathedral again, small, trembling, alive. You stop needing to be understood, because the act of trying to understand him consumes you. You forget to ask if he sees you. You only ask what he means. You turn your own soul into a lantern, shining outward, illuminating his darkness, and you call that love. He does not explain himself, and that makes you believe he has something worth explaining. You do not fall in love with the man. You fall in love with the absence around him, with the questions he never answers, with the stillness that feels like prayer. You assign meaning to his silence. You assign value to his cruelty. And when he does not text, you decide it is because he is wrestling with something vast, something only your patience can redeem. You become the redeemer, the martyr, the saint, and he becomes God by doing nothing at all. The cruelty is not in his silence. The cruelty is in how much of yourself you abandon to make it meaningful. You forget what you need. You forget what you want. You sit at his feet waiting for a word that never comes. And when it doesn't come, you lower your standards. You rewrite your prayers. You tell yourself that mystery is better than honesty, that silence is more romantic than speech, that men who talk are weak, that men who explain are small, that men who show you their wounds are not worthy of your bandages. And this belief, this altar you built, is where your own voice was sacrificed. He never asked for your worship, but he never stopped you from kneeling. There is a kind of man who becomes sacred not because of what he is, but because of what he withholds. You meet him once, and the rest of your life becomes echo. You do not remember the words he said. You remember the silence between them. You remember how it made you ache, and you begin to crave the ache more than the man. You become addicted to the unsaid, to the ache, to the unanswered question, because in that question, you feel most alive. You do not want a man. You want a riddle you cannot solve, and so you wait. You sit in the cathedral with no priest. The candles burn down. The echo fades. But you stay, because the absence feels safer than the mess of real intimacy. Because as long as he never explains himself, you never have to face the disappointment of who he truly is. His silence protects your fantasy. His detachment preserves your devotion. And in that silence, you become not a lover, not a partner, not a woman, but a worshipper of a ghost. If he spoke, the ghost would die. So he does not speak, and you do not ask. You just wait, and wonder, and burn. And in that burning, you believe you have found love. But what you've really found is a cathedral built from your own loneliness. And you've crowned him a god because he never asked to be human. When a man withholds his reasons, he denies you the power to define him, and you call that mystery love. You sit across from him, and there is no image, no reflection. He listens without responding, watches without revealing, and everything inside you begins to twist, because you are so used to seeing your feelings echoed back, your questions met with reassurances, your anger met with apology. But he is a mirror that gives nothing back, and still, you lean closer. You try to find your shape in his silence, but it swallows every outline. You ask him what he meant when he left. He shrugs. You ask him why he never told you how he felt. He blinks. You ask him if he ever loved you, and his pause becomes a maze you live inside for days. You replay that breath, that twitch of the mouth, that look to the side. You turn it into a symbol. You convince yourself that meaning must be there because to accept that it isn't would shatter the only story you trust. He never answers. And so, you keep guessing. And because you keep guessing, he becomes infinite. There is no greater power than the power to remain undefined. Every time you try to pin him down with words, with logic, with love, he slips away like steam. He never denies you. He simply does not confirm. He is not cruel, but he is not kind. And that space in between that empty hallway becomes your home. You decorate it with theories. You sleep inside hypotheticals. You try on identities: the woman who understands him, the woman who saves him, the woman who waits. And every time he doesn't speak, you rearrange the furniture. You do not see him. You only see your desire to be seen. You tell yourself he must be deep. Why else would he withhold? You tell yourself he must be afraid. Why else would he resist intimacy? You invent pain behind his eyes. You paint trauma into his pauses. You sculpt tragedy into his posture, because you believe that silence is always suffering, that mystery is always merit. But sometimes, silence is just emptiness, and mystery is just a refusal. Still, you love him, not for what he is, but for what he might be if only he let you in. You imagine that one day, he'll finally speak. He'll crack open. He'll tell you everything. And that moment, that mythical future moment, becomes your religion. You wait for it. You earn it with your patience, your softness, your sacrifice. You believe that if you never push too hard, if you always forgive, if you prove your loyalty through quiet endurance, then one day he will reward you with himself. And that reward will feel like resurrection. He will finally see you and speak to you and reflect you. But that day never comes, because he never promised it. He never lied to you. He simply never answered. And because he never answered, you never stopped hoping. If he had said, "I don't love you," you would have left. If he had said, "You're not the one," you would have cried, then moved on. But he never gave you that gift. He gave you silence, which is more addictive than honesty, because silence lets you write the story yourself. And you wrote a masterpiece. You made his silence mean everything, and now you cannot live without the question. He becomes your mirror, but not one that reflects your face. He reflects your hunger, your projections, your wounds. He gives you nothing, and so you give everything. You become obsessed with decoding him. Every moment becomes a riddle. You read between every line. You text him a single sentence and wait 5 hours, then reread your message 30 times. Was it too needy, too cold, too vulnerable? You change your behavior based on his absence and call that growth. He shapes you by not showing you who he is, and because you do not know who he is, you lose who you are. You forget what you wanted. You forget what you believed. You become someone designed to please a man who has never revealed his criteria, and still you chase it because it feels like love, because it feels like importance, because the more he withholds, the more valuable he must be. He doesn't have to lift a finger. You shape yourself around his void. You used to believe that love was mutual, that it involved seeing and being seen. But now, love is a pursuit, a hunger, a mission. And this man who offers no explanation becomes your purpose. You measure your worth by the inches he gives you. You mistake his silence for superiority. You believe that if you can earn his words, you will finally earn yourself. You believe his approval is the only mirror that will show you who you truly are. But the tragedy is this: he is not a mirror. He is a wall, and your love is not being reflected, it is being absorbed. And still, you stay, because leaving would mean accepting that you were never seen, that your love was poured into stone, that the cathedral you built in part 1 had no God, and that truth is too unbearable. So you continue to believe that one day he'll change. One day he'll look at you and see you. One day he'll give you the explanation that makes it all make sense. But you are the only one writing the script. He does not explain himself, and you call that strength. You call that masculinity. You call that gravity. Because in a world of oversharing and confession, he is an enigma. And enigmas feel safe not because they are trustworthy, but because they cannot be disproven. You cannot be rejected by a man who never defines the terms. And so, you keep applying. You keep trying. You keep breathing in silence and calling it perfume. You fall in love with what he withholds, and slowly forget what it is to be loved for what you reveal. You used to want connection, now you want access. You used to want to be understood, now you want to be chosen. You want to be the one he finally explains himself to, the one who unlocks him, the one who melts the stone. But he has no intention of melting. He never said he was frozen. He never asked to be thawed. That was your fantasy. That was your mirror. You do not love him. You love what you hope his silence hides. And you will chase that hope until it kills the part of you that once spoke freely, asked openly, cried without shame. Because with him, you cannot afford to break. You cannot afford to need. You must always be strategic, subtle, low maintenance. You must always be guessing, and the longer you guess, the more powerful he becomes. He remains undefined and you become undone, and still, you stare into that mirror, begging it to show you something, a flicker, a crack, a reflection of all you gave. But it shows you nothing, because it was never a mirror, only a veil, and behind it, there may be nothing at all. You return to the man who offers no answer, because in his silence you write your own suffering and call it fate. The door never opened, not once. Yet you kept knocking as if your bloodline depended on it. The silence wasn't a denial, it was an invitation, or so you told yourself. Because it felt sacred, that stillness, like a bell in the distance that never rings, but still governs every motion in your body. You stand in its invisible pull, wondering when it will sound, not knowing that the silence is the sound, not knowing that this is not waiting, it is worship. You weren't drawn to him because he gave you peace. You were drawn because he made your pain feel important. That dull ache in your chest when he didn't reply, that sharp knot in your stomach when he left the room mid-conversation. You told yourself it meant something, that your suffering was part of some larger pattern, that it would all resolve in a final, beautiful unveiling, a moment of clarity, of arrival, of transcendence. But it never came, and the longer you waited, the more poetic your own wounds became. You bled in metaphors, you broke in rhythms, you loved him with the quiet of a woman convinced that being unseen is a form of destiny. You told your friends he was different, you told yourself he was damaged. And each time he vanished emotionally, physically, spiritually, you swallowed the hollowness like communion. You believed it meant you were chosen to carry his silence. There are men who ring loud, men who speak, cry, confess, collapse. They explain themselves in detail. They bring their trauma to the table like a centerpiece. And those men exhausted you. You didn't want another story to fix. You wanted silence to believe in. You wanted stillness that punished you just enough to feel divine. And so, you found him the man who said nothing. promised nothing, revealed nothing, and in him, you found something to blame your ache on that didn't feel like chaos. It felt like design. You called it mystery. You called it complexity. You even called it fate. But fate doesn't ignore your voice. It doesn't watch you cry and hand you silence as comfort. That's not destiny, that's distance. But you stayed. You wrote novels in the margins of his absence. You traced your longing into fate's handwriting. You believed your devotion would bend the silence toward you, that your loyalty would warm the bell until it rang. But silence doesn't warm, it doesn't melt, it doesn't bend, it just stays. You tried to leave once, didn't you? Packed your things emotionally or literally and said, "I'm done." And in the quiet that followed, you felt a pull, not from him, but from the absence itself. That ache returned like a compass needle twitching toward pain. You thought that meant he missed you, that it was some spiritual bond, some invisible thread. But it wasn't. It was the addiction to your own unfulfilled narrative, the one where he finally sees you, the one where the bell finally rings. You mistake your longing for a message from the universe. You pray to a God made from a man's unwillingness to answer. You shape your life around the possibility of transformation, not yours, but his, because if he changes, then your pain was worth something. If he speaks, then your silence was noble. If he reaches back, then the years you spent waiting become holy. But he doesn't, and still you stay. You build your theology from his silence, and call your pain a pilgrimage. You have forgotten your own voice. You used to speak with clarity. You used to know what you wanted. But now, everything is phrased as a question. Am I asking too much? Was that the wrong thing to say? Did I imagine the connection? You shrink in your own mouth. You hesitate before every text. You read between every line. Not because he's cruel, but because he's nothing. And that nothingness is your canvas, your wound, your shrine. You return to him not because of love, but because of the meaning you've assigned your suffering. There is a sickness in longing. It disguises itself as loyalty. It whispers, just one more chance, just one more gesture, just one more miracle. And each time you believe it. Not because you're weak, but because hope is stronger than history. And your history with him is one long silence interrupted by crumbs. A half smile, a delayed reply. A night where he said something almost tender, then vanished again. And you write entire scriptures from those crumbs. You remember the days you begged God for signs. You thought maybe he was the sign, maybe he was the test. Maybe your pain was the path, but paths lead somewhere. And this is a circle, a loop, a spell. And the worst part is you cast it yourself. He never asked you to wait, but he never told you to go. And so, you orbit. You revolve around him like a planet around a dead star, hoping it will reignite, praying that your gravity will awaken his. But stars do not wake. They collapse, quietly, beautifully, and you mistake that collapse for depth, for sacred grief, for tragic romance. But tragedy only becomes myth when it ends, and he will not end it. He will let you go not with drama, but with silence, with a final unread message, with a vague smile at a party, with nothing at all, and you will walk away, carrying all the questions he never answered. You will tell people it just didn't work out. You won't say that it never began. Because to admit that is to admit that you built your love on a whisper, a shadow, a void, and that your pain was not wholly only unreturned. But you're not ready for that. Not yet. So you write him into your story again. You imagine he'll come back, or explain, or apologize. You give him lines in your dreams. You picture him at your door, confessing everything. You prepare your speech. You rehearse forgiveness. But none of it comes, because the bell never rings. Not because it's broken, but because it was never meant to. And in that silence, you finally hear something terrifying. Not his voice, yours. Your own voice, crying out through the ache, asking why you ever believed this was fate, asking when you began mistaking silence for destiny, asking if you remember who you were before you loved a man who never spoke. That voice is not loud, but it is yours, and it does not ask for permission to ring. There is a bell tower on a hill where no one lives, no priest, no choir, no wind, just a rusted bell that never moves. And still, every evening, someone walks up the hill to listen, not because it ever rang, but because one day it might, and because they can't remember what silence felt like before they started waiting.